Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicquel Ellis, and I am the senior writer covering race inequality for CNN. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today to our panel. We will discuss racism at the front end of the child welfare system in today's panel. We are here to name institutional racism as a force at work at the front end of the American child welfare system, and to learn how we can work toward ending the unjust, unnecessary, and devastating removal of Black children from their families by dismantling the structures in place that systemically target, surveil, and punish Black families. Our discussion has been shaped by a new report just released by Children's Rights that puts forth a sweeping plan of action to stop unnecessary government involvement in the lives of Black families. The report details how Black families have been subjected to the unnecessary interference and forced separation. It makes the case that many of the families caught up in the child welfare system should have never entered the front door. As the report spells out, the child welfare system has a history of racism dating from the exclusion of Black families during the early 19th to mid 20th centuries. And as you will hear, the impact of Black children involved with this system is devastating, imposing lifelong trauma that can result in negative outcomes later in life, including poor developmental health, entanglement with other systems, and including the criminal legal system. Today, we'll hear from our panelists who are uniquely qualified to bring these issues to life. We'll spend a half hour hearing from them, and then we'll dedicate 15 minutes to your questions. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat in our Zoom here, and we will get to them. And also, please specify if your question is for a certain panelist. We hope to get to every question, but we realize that we have a full audience here, so we will do our best. I am now pleased to introduce our panelists. First, we have Kimberly Mays, who was a social services worker and a policy consultant with the Birth Parent National Network and a mother who has lived experience with the foster care system. Next, we have Kathleen Kramer, who is a managing attorney for Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. She represents parents in family court. Shireen White is a senior staff attorney at Children's Rights and the lead author of the new report. And Shanta Trivedi is a clinical teaching fellow at the Georgetown University Law Center and a leading expert on child welfare and trauma. Welcome and thank you all for sitting on this panel. So my first question is for you, Kimberly. You advise parents involved with the Washington State Child Care Agency who are obviously facing some huge challenges. You're also a mother with lived experience, as I noted when I introduced you. We know that Black children are unnecessarily removed from their families, not because of abuse, but because of the circumstances in the child welfare system that defines neglect. We also know that because of a broad, vague legal definitions, neglect is often conflated with poverty. Can you tell us how this confusion of a lack of financial resources and with parental neglect played out in your own life as a mother, and give examples of the work that you do with parents today?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. I just want to start off with saying that neglect also is behavioral health issues are labeled under neglect. So you can have a substance use disorder, you can have food in your house, kids can go to school, everything's fine. You come up dirty for a UA for a baby, and because you can't stay clean, because you haven't had the treatment yet, they'll remove your kids just for having substances in you, which is heard legally not, you're not supposed to do that, but they still are able to do that. So when I think about the disproportionality and disparities that families of color suffer from removals, it reminds me of the slave trading days when brown and Black families were lined up on a platform and then separated and sold like cattle. And that's this impression I get when I see I've been working here for 17 years, and They removed this brown mom's baby last week when we worked 6 months with her, thinking that she's going to keep her baby, and they just removed her for some past stuff, like we don't know, instead of putting in services in place to keep the baby home. So that's when that connotation came to me. I'm like, this reminds me of that because this was so unfair. I also, during my own dependency cases, I had a hard time getting the services I needed due to the department not sending my referrals out in a timely manner, being on long wait lists for services that I needed, and being shuffled around from agency to agency. Then you get there, you don't qualify, but you already waited that long for that. Then you got to make another appointment, etc. By that time, many of your crises and your issues that parent families have crumble. So everything started deteriorating on me. It got worse and not better. Housing was my biggest barrier, and it's for many families that I work with. The leading barrier to reunification in our state, Washington State, is housing. And the department requires you to get housing before your kids come home, but the housing programs require your kids to be home already. So you're in an oxymoron, you're in a conflict right there. It's extremely disheartening to have the federal timeline counting against families when it's actually the systemic barriers that preclude many families from meeting that timeline, 15 to 22 months, right? And as a defense social worker, I'll never forget this case. This is my last thing I want to share. There was a mother of 3, no safety concerns, drug issues, nothing. She did not make enough money to pay for daycare for her 3 kids, 9, 5, and 4, but she made too much money to qualify for subsidized childcare. Childcare is very expensive in Washington, like almost $1,000 a kid, right? Okay, and so the department's response when they got a phone call and they investigated and saw no other safety concerns, but no one to supervise her children, their best thinking was to pull those 3 children, which costs way more money to pull 3 kids, put them in foster care, court judges, the lawyers, all that, right? And then 5 weeks later, give those kids back to her with daycare subsidy. Unbelievable. So that's my experience. It's baffling that they had to go through all that just to get daycare. So it's most of all the intense trauma that this family experienced, especially the kids who were always afraid of being pulled after that, after conversing no longer, they had a lot of trauma over that unnecessary removal. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that with us, Kimberly. The next question is for Kathleen. Kathleen, for a number of years, you've represented Black parents in Philadelphia who have had their children taken from them by the state. Can you talk about the systemic issues that have led to these Black children being taken from their families?
Absolutely. And first, I just want to thank you for having me and thank you for this panel. I think this is such an important conversation. What I think a lot of folks who don't look like me understand is that our law and policy and practice has created a system of surveillance, control, and separation for Black families. I see that play out in my practice every day. I want to share with you, first of all, what is the law that is driving this? One major law that is called out in the report that I would like to call out is CAPTA. CAPTA requires that folks who suspect child abuse and neglect call in hotline reports on families. And then allows each state to create its own category of mandated reporters, people who must call in their suspicion. The standard for suspicion is reasonable suspicion, and I would invite our panelists and our audience to reflect on the way that the term reasonable suspicion invites our bias. And then you see that bias play out in practice because we know in America, half of Black children will experience a CPS investigation, which is in of itself a trauma for a family. And then we have a system of state laws that really, again, invite bias and racism to the table because we have these very vague state laws around what is neglect. So just to give you some examples from Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, we have a law that says that the court can intervene in the life of your family if you have failed to provide your child with proper care. The standard is proper care. I would invite, again, our audience to reflect on the word proper and also reflect on times that you have made parenting choices that other people may deem improper. Again, folks like me who are kind of free from this net of surveillance and control get to make those parenting decisions without a lot of scrutiny. My clients do not have that same benefit. So just to give you some examples of things that my clients have been found improper for doing within their families. I love that Kimberly called out this one because we have seen it, leaving a child unsupervised, right? That has been deemed improper. Refusing to send a child to a dangerous school where you know your child is being maliciously bullied and it's dangerous for her to go. Watching an accidental injury at home, waiting to run to the hospital, just watching it at home. And then also putting your child to bed and smoking a marijuana joint before you yourself go to bed. So all of these things are kind of actions that you see white parents kind of take in their communities without any scrutiny whatsoever that can and will land Black families within that web of surveillance, control, and separation.
Thank you, Kathleen. My next question is for Shanta. Shanta, you're an author, a teacher, and an expert on the trauma sustained by children who are removed from their families. Can you talk to us about the trauma of removal and why it's so critical for us to think about that and understand it?
Yeah, I also want to say thank you to Children's Rights first for including me in this incredible group of advocates, but more importantly for writing this thoughtful, well-researched, and very powerful report. So let's talk about the harm of removal. When I was representing parents at Brooklyn Defenders, which is an office very similar to Kathleen's practice in Philadelphia, I once had a case in which 6 children were at risk of removal because my client, the children's mother, allegedly waited too long to seek medical care for one of the children's eczema. 6 children were going to be removed from the only parent they'd ever known not because the mother hadn't sought medical care, but because the doctor felt she had waited 1 day too long. So 6 kids ranging from ages 1 to 12 would be separated not only from their mother, but from each other because finding a foster home to house 6 children is virtually impossible. They'd have to switch schools and they would be in different neighborhoods. And that's the kind of information that I could present in court because I happened to practice in New York at the time. And that's a jurisdiction where the harm of removal is balanced with the harm to their child if they remain in the parent's care. And I think that the separation crisis at the southern border was a real turning point for this country in understanding how devastating it is for children to be separated from their parents. We're finally able to have conversations about the fact that that very same trauma is being inflicted every day by the family regulation system and other legal systems. And I think it's not hard for people to imagine what it would be like for a child if they were suddenly removed from their beds in the middle of the night, which very frequently happens, or from their parents' arms, without knowing when they're going to see their parent again or when they're going to go home. And it is a fact that even when parents are less than perfect, which I don't know about you, those of you who are parents, we're all imperfect. No matter what, children will suffer irreversible harm when they're separated from their parents. They suffer anxiety, grief, depression. And even when we have these so-called short stays in foster care, it seems, 3 days for a child is a lifetime. And the trauma that's inflicted even from these so-called short stays, that trauma can last forever. And then in addition to those kinds of harms are the harms of foster care itself. So many children report physical and sexual abuse in foster care. Children are moved from home to group homes. And the long-term outcomes for children in foster care are really tragic. Compared to their peers, they're more likely to have criminal legal system involvement, to be poor, to drop out of high school, to be teen parents, to be homeless. One study found that foster children suffer rates of PTSD at nearly twice the rates of US war veterans. Let that sink in for a minute. American children in foster care are suffering rates of PTSD that are higher than people who have gone to war. So when we're deciding whether to remove a child from his or her parents, in most jurisdictions in the country, judges don't have any obligation to consider that kind of information. They can literally pretend it doesn't exist. And what is really astounding is that in these proceedings, all we talk about is the potential speculative risk of harm from leaving a child with her parents when we know that the harms of removal are certain. So many cases, as was Kimberly's experience and was the experience of many of Kathleen's clients, we're removing kids from their parents because of so-called neglect that's really poverty, such as unstable housing or inadequate supervision because of a lack of childcare, and then placing them into foster care, even though we know that a child who is removed from their parent will suffer harm. And likely not just one harm, right? We're talking about multiple and compounded and long-lasting harm.
Wow, such good insight, Shanta. Thank you so much for that. My next question is for you, Shireen. Shireen, I recently wrote a story about 16-year-old Mikaya Bryant out of Columbus, Ohio. She was fatally shot by a police officer while she was wielding a knife in front of her foster care home. And I found that there were a lot of systemic issues that were that kind of affected her, and the system had essentially failed her because there were a lot of issues at the home that she was in that could have been unsafe for a 16-year-old child to be living in those conditions. So my question for you is, what does childcare need to do to keep children at home with their parents to prevent tragedies like the fatal police shooting of Mikaya Bryant?
Yeah, thank you, Nicquel. What happened to Mikaya Bryant is absolutely devastating. And I thank you for your story, which emphasizes so many of the harms connected with the child welfare system. Mikaya was already removed from her mom and in the foster care system. And according to the most recent data, there are over 150,000 Black children in foster care in this country. And we have to ask ourselves, did they absolutely have to be removed from their homes? Was that a first course of action by the agency? Was it a last course of action by the agency? Was that family offered any kind of services? Did they have access to the services and supports they need? And what we know is that communities in this country are so under-resourced, right? And what we also know is that the way the system is structured right now, far too often, families have to turn to the system. They have to turn to the child welfare system, the same system that can remove your child or threaten to remove your child is the same system you're expected to turn to for help, supports, and trust. And that just can't be, that should not be. And so, like so many advocates have been speaking out about the need to really resource communities and pour funds into communities rather than in the child welfare system. So that's one of our recommendations in the call to action. It's about doing everything in our power to service families, keep families together, and de-link funding from the child welfare system for services and support so that, if you need mental health treatment, or if you need substance abuse treatment or family therapy, any kind of supports, you should be able to go outside of the child welfare system and into your community to receive them.
Thank you for that, Shireen. Kathleen, I want to talk to you about family preservation. Under current under current law, a child welfare agency must show that it made reasonable efforts to preserve a family before a child is removed in order to receive federal funds. You've written and spoken about how we need to raise the standard to which agencies are held to preserve families and keep children in their homes. Children's Rights recommends that it's time to change the law and universally require active efforts to be made to prevent the separation of families by the child welfare system. What would that look like?
Sorry, I think this is such an important recommendation. We have a standard right now in America that says you only have to try reasonably to avoid irreparable lifelong harm to a child, and really racially biased harm to a child. And that can't be our standard. We can't just reasonably try to avoid devastating lifelong harm to Black children and communities. We have to make active efforts to avoid that harm. I want to call out a couple things in the report. One, I just want to recognize and thank Children's Rights for calling out the need for a robust right to counsel for parents and children, and parents beginning at the investigation phase when DHS is supposed to be making those reasonable efforts. Because what we know is that we could statutorily raise that standard, but unless there's somebody fighting for that parent in that parent's corner, we won't see enforcement of the standard, because right now we have this very low bar of reasonable efforts, and even that is rarely enforced. And you will hear from leaders across this country telling you that reasonable efforts is a standard that most places can't meet. So we have to raise the standard for family separation and pair it with a robust right to counsel for parents in these cases. So what does that look like? I think that's a really important question. First of all, the things that my clients need are very rarely the things that DHS has to offer. My clients often don't need services. They need material, concrete supports. So active efforts would be connecting moms and dads to access to housing, access to public benefits, access to medical care, access to safe schools, and when needed, a lawyer to help them get at those things, because we know that all of these institutions have their own problems with systemic racism. It would also just revolve around the principle of, instead of removing the child from the home, what could we do to remove the harm or the safety threat from the home, right? So right now, the default is, I see a safety threat, I'm going to remove that child. Instead, we need a fundamental shift to say, I see a safety threat, what can I do to remove the threat? And so that can look like a lot of different things. It really requires creativity, hands-on problem solving, and this is really crucial and really challenging for a system that is dominated by white professionals. It requires sharing power with families and letting them drive the solutions, right? Families are best situated to know what they need. And so just some examples of what creative problem solving could look like would be, there's a safety threat. Can a relative move into the home so that the mom and the child don't have to be separated? There's a safety threat. Can the child and parent go stay somewhere else? Maybe the house is not safe. Can they go stay at grandpa's house for the night? That would be a way to keep them safely together. Overall, I think we have to have a fundamental shift in our understanding of what kind of efforts we have to make to prevent separation that starts with the question, what would it take to keep the family safely together and avoid the dramatic and devastating harm of family separation? That should be the first question we're asking, and then moving forward from that.
Very good points, Kathleen, and hopefully those are things that can be considered by the child welfare system moving forward in their efforts to preserve the family. My next question is for you, Kimberly. Kimberly, earlier Shanta talked about the trauma that children experience from being taken from their families, which we know can be devastating. But the trauma of removal isn't just felt by the child. Can you talk about the ways in which it affects parents and families as a whole?
Okay, thank you so much. So I just want to start off by saying that removing children from their families and placing them with strangers in foster care in many cases is like a cure that is worse than the disease it is trying to cure. So that's how I frame that. Me and my children not only experienced removal, but we also experienced termination of my parental rights. My issues that brought me into care was one of my children tested positive for cocaine because I started developing a substance use disorder. Having two kids already there was really hard for me to figure out who's going to keep my kids if I go to treatment. So, and how they responded to me was removing all my kids. And then I got treatment way later in the case, I think about 6 months later, and then it was only short term, and that wasn't what I needed. What me and my family needed at that time was a long-term treatment facility that took mothers and their children, because my kids were young enough, so that we could have not only got a stay together, but got treated together and heal together. And that's what is happening to families to this day. They were pulling kids for a medically diagnosed illness when and then 6 months, maybe 9 months later, you get to go to treatment, maybe, right? With your kids. And it's insane when should be the immediate response. They're penalizing and criminalizing substance disorders and other disorders. So in my own case, due to the systemic barriers, lack of treatment, et cetera, housing resources, and then I started getting incarcerated to stemming from my untreated behavioral health issues. And so in my particular case, I developed PTSD, I found out, and some other mental health disorders from losing my first set of kids, which the judge said housing was a barrier. I did too little, too late. And I didn't know that went untreated. So a lot of parents come back in the system or have more kids with untreated trauma to deal with the loss of the first ones, right? So I went through 4 different dependency cases, and I lost 9 children in each one of those cases. 4 in the first case, 3 in the second case, and in the last 2, my experience in child welfare is when the kids are removed, you don't get them back. So I didn't even fight for those, basically. And then I spiraled way out of control. During my 10th pregnancy, I recognized I was pregnant, and by then I'd been in mental health hospitals. I've been incarcerated many times. My life was over. So I turned my life over to the care of God, and I reached out for some help. One lady, Roxanne Brown, she's a 0 to 3 birth to 3 worker, hand walked me to get the services I needed, housing. Within 3 months, within 2 weeks, I was clean and sober in services. And then within 3 months, I had my own housing and I was doing well. I enrolled in college. So in my last dependency case, my 5th one, my daughter was born clean. I was born clean. And I was in another county in treatment. So the African-American unit let me keep my baby. Moved back 30 miles back to my own county after treatment. And I enrolled in college to start in 2 months. So I want to get a little job and get a car so that I can buy a car and go to school in January. This is October. I called child welfare to ask for daycare assistance. The 2 workers came to my house the next day. First of all, they called me within an hour later, go, "Oh my God, you got a baby, where are you?" I'm like, "Cool out, come over." So they sent 2 workers over, checked out everything. Everything was great. They got on the phone with me to pay for the daycare. I told them we will pay. The next day they came to my door in tears, both of them, with the police, saying that their supervisors, who were my old workers, said, "I don't care what Kimberly Mays is doing, go get those babies." So long story short, I had enough community support and enough success under me to enroll in college 2 months later with no baby at home, breastfeeding baby. And at my dismissal here, I got her back. It took them 11 months to decide to give me, and you know, my services order had one sentence: keep doing what you're doing. I did that with her at home breastfeeding, right? So it took 11 months for me to get my daughter back to me. And all I did was turn in my A's from college. That's the only thing I turned in because I was done with everything well before they get my baby back. And then, but the beautiful thing that came out of this, at my dismissal hearing, I impressed the stakeholders and the judge so much. They shut the courtroom down, had a party, and asked me to start the first Parent for Parent program in our state. It's now a national model and a statewide model, boom. But 2.5 years of serving crazily like a maniac, get these kids home and taking van loads of parents to get them signed up for services. And we started getting anecdotal rates that parents would get their kids back, right? By the grace of God, I found 7 of my children under the age of 18, from the 3 till 17 years old. I found them. And that changed why I do this work. I heard their stories. And why I do this work is so that children do not have to lose their biological families. Because in my case, 7 of my children were horribly abused in state care, sexually, mentally, physically, right? So my one son, I try to answer his question. He keeps saying, "Mom, why did they take me from you and put us in worse situations?" Right? And that's what my kids' story are. And that's the stories I'm hearing from parents and former youth involved that are now parents in our system. It's just not the sure fit. In fact, the rates are getting higher of the abuse that is happening to children in foster care. So I believe I do this work now. How can we support bio parents so that they can thrive better and get their own kids back? Another thing is, for parents, I have a master's degree. I'm a local, state, national policy consultant paid. I'm a full-time defense social worker. I've helped champion 16 laws in our state, and I'm a licensed foster parent at the youth who cannot be housed anywhere else. And they're in college now, one's in high school. They're just doing amazing, right? But yet and still, one thing that me and the parents who've been through this process share in common is that we will always suffer extreme grief, loss, remorse, PTSD, and just triggers on from losing our children in such an egregious way when we didn't, and then what happened to our kids. Also, there's a lot of grief and what do you call it? Self-loathing sometimes, and guilt and shame over what other people did to your own kids. Lastly, I just want to end with no matter how, okay, I like to end with this. I found another one of my daughters, when I found her, she was 11. She wrote me a letter when she was 8. I lost her when she was 4. At 8 years old, my daughter wrote a letter saying that she didn't even know if she'd ever see me, but she just held on to it, right? And in one of the in part of that letter, she said, "Mommy, there is a huge hole in my heart that cannot be fixed until I see you again." That completely broke my heart, and I cried like a newborn baby when she read it to me. So one of my other children also wanted me to leave this with she said, my other daughter said, "Mom, please tell the people you are working with, please don't save me from my parents. Save my parents for me." Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. That was very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you all. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing all your insight and your experience with us today. We're going to move on to the Q&A portion of our panel. We have a handful of questions that have been dropped into the queue. I'm going to ask the first one here, which is to all of the panelists or anyone who wants to answer. It says, do you have an opinion on the process of blind removal that is being used by some counties to combat institutional racism in the child welfare system?
I can take this one if no one else wants to. Oh, Kathleen, you can go ahead. So for those of you who don't know what blind removals are, before the decision is made about whether or not to refer a case to court for removal, there's usually a meeting. And at that meeting, the parent sits with caseworkers who discuss the safety concerns. And the idea is, or there is a file of paperwork that is reviewed to make a decision about whether children should be removed. And the idea of blind removals is that from that file, from that information, all identifying data such as race, marital status, income, address, sexual orientation, religion, depending on the state, is removed so that just the facts are reviewed for removal. And this type of approach was done in Nassau County, New York, and removals of Black children went down, I believe, 29%, which tells you a lot. So I'm personally in favor of blind removals as one thing that we can add, because as we know, there's bias at each stage. And this is the first step of removing kids from their parents, is this meeting. I think it's not going to work all by itself. We need to look at the other recommendations that are made in the report. We need to talk more about, one of the recommendations in the report is, switching from anonymous reporting to confidential reporting. We need to take a hard look at the system of mandated reporting generally, as it is a major source of referrals to the child welfare system in the first place. And the people who are mandated reporters are teachers, social workers, doctors, and they are under penalty of losing their licenses or facing criminal penalties if they don't report, which leads to, over-reporting. So this blind removals in combination with rethinking mandated reporting, as well as access to counsel for parents, I think are 3 things we want to do in combination at the very least.
Thank you, Shanta. The next question in the queue says, I work as a foster care worker. What can we do to help children in this situation? How can we help keep children in their homes? Who's taking that?
I like to stab at it. I think that the best way to keep kids at home, we need to take some of those dollars that are being funneled into foster care and utilize and invest in the community infrastructure to be able to serve their own families, particularly behavioral health services, which most of our families come in for. So I believe it takes we do a cost benefit analysis. If we spend the money that we already have earmarked, federal money already earmarked for 5 whole years held like a bank in there for foster youth, we can borrow from the 4th and 5th year, bring that money back to invest in infrastructure and capacities of the service providers who are already in the communities, which will reduce racial inequity because they're already serving families. So that's one of my reasons. I mean, one of the ideas I think, if we to build the infrastructure for families to have somewhere to go and change the mandatory reporters to mandatory referrers, and save the reporting for the 20% or less who come in for issues that are egregious. The other 80%, we've got to find a better way to not even have them call on families, right? Change that where they're mandated to connect them to services, right? Mandated referrers and then mandated reporters for the 20% or less egregious cases. Thank you.
And I'm going to add on to that. Thank you, Kimberly. We got to check our own biases when we're involved with the families and doing the investigating and doing the foster care work. And, for so many circumstances, removal shouldn't even be on the table. It shouldn't be the first thought, the first course of action. It's got to be your last. And so, we all need to just take it upon ourselves and think about what are all the ways that you can help keep this child at home, ensure everybody is safe. And too many times removal is the first course of action, and we need to change that mindset.
And Shireen, another driving factor, just want to hit the dead horse alive again. A driving factor when a social worker, I talk to a lot of social workers and we're really close. Yeah. One of the reasons is if you have nowhere to take this family to right now, or there's no services available in the community to help them, they feel like their hands are tied and they have no choice but to remove. So we have to simultaneously, while we're building, fly the plane while we're building it, while we're trying to work on not removing kids, it's not a feasible plan without somewhere to service and treat the families.
Absolutely.
Thank you both for answering that question. We have another question from the audience for Kathleen. Can Kathleen comment on the Children's Bureau's movement toward child well-being, given concerns of surveillance, government outreach, and current practices and policies? Doesn't this federal attempt to reinvent the agency as one focused on well-being rather than safety translate into just one more way the state will be able to justify involvement in families with little accountability for the reasons?
I love this question. And, I'm a mom. I love kids. I'm all about child well-being. It's why I do this work. But I do think we have to recognize that families need ways to access well-being that is not tied or linked in any way to an agency that has the power to surveil, punish, and control and separate. Families are not going to trust a system that brands itself as a system of child well-being that continues the surveillance, control, and separation apparatus. So I do think there is a very good argument for a de-link, and I think that's one of the things that is a recommendation in the report. We really need to de-link the accessibility of services for families from Title IV-E, which is where child welfare agencies get their federal dollars. Families are not particularly trusting. If you go into Black communities, if you talk to Black moms, they don't want their services from child welfare. They're terrified of child welfare. So, and then I also just want to call out, a lot of folks have called out mandated reporting. To the extent that we're creating a child well-being system that continues to put mandated reporters in families' homes, again, we are scaring families. We are driving them away from help. And I think Kimberly's story is so resonant and powerful. She called the agency for help. That's what she did. She said, I don't have childcare. I'm going to call the agency for help with childcare. And she was met with 11 months away from her infant. So I applaud the government for focusing on the issue of child well-being. I believe in child well-being, but I believe that well-being lies in communities.
Thank you, Kathleen, for answering that. I have another question for Shireen about the report. It says, Shireen, your report and the work that children's rights and all of the advocates here today do is so incredibly important. How can the rest of us get involved and make this change happen? It's a good question.
Thank you so much for that question. And of course, I have to thank the tremendous team that I had the opportunity to work with on this report at Children's Rights. So Ira, McKenna, Elissa, Nicquel, Asha, Marissa, Jill, thank you so much for just your dedication and commitment to this work over the last few months. It's been incredible to work with you, and I'm really proud of the report that we ended up with. A huge thank you to the many people across this country who gave us so much of their time to discuss these critical issues. And a thank you to our panelists for joining us today. And I would say that the report is sort of twofold, right? There is a lot of information there because there have been many people who have written about these issues. They're not new for decades. And so it was important for us to lift up all of the work that's already been put out there on these issues. And so there's an education component, and we would say, you know, educate yourselves, pass the report along so that others can be educated about the harms and the impact that the racism within the system has on Black children and families. And the second part is, you know, in this next phase of things, we want to work with others to make these legislative and legal recommendations a reality across this country. So I think at some point there should be a link in the chat for people to sign our pledge, which is your own personal acknowledgement about the role that racism plays in the child welfare system and the impact that it has. And so we'd say sign on to that pledge, and we hope we get to work with you as we continue this work. Thank you.
We have one more minute. There's one more really good question that I'm just going to ask really quickly. This one person asked, I am an attorney and a child welfare specialist in Georgia. Our child welfare system is headed by white men and women who claim to empathize with Black and brown families, but actually reinforce white supremacy paternalism. My biggest complaint continues to be that racism is systemic and infects our child welfare system as in most other institutions from the top down. How do we disrupt the good old boy infrastructure that wants to reinforce this white supremacy by refusing to diversify the leadership at the top? I need one of you to answer that question as quickly as you can.
Call it out. I mean, that's all you can do, right? Name it when you see it, which is easier said than done, depending on your position. But I don't know that there's any other way than to just name it when you see it and make people question their own decision-making and acknowledge their own bias.
Good. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your insight, your experience, and hopefully this panel will spark more conversation about the issue with racism in the child welfare system and, you know, what can be done to improve this system and, you know, the structural barriers that keep children away from Black children away from their families. Thank you to our audience for tuning in, and thank you to Children's Rights for hosting this panel today.